Hi guys, welcome to my channel, Patterns by D. My name is D and today's tutorial is on the Fernanda Blazer by Vicky Sews. Now if you haven't hit that notification bell for upcoming videos and tutorials, please do so. So with further ado, let's get started. Now the first thing I want to talk about is how I love this blazer, because when I saw it on the website, I just love how the silhouette fit on the model. And I also like the length. I just like the whole look about it because it looks so clean and sharp. I want to also talk about the size that I chose. I chose a size 38, which in European, which is a size 8 in US. Now I should have went up a couple sizes to a size 40, or 42, which is a size 10-12 in US, because of just the sleeve. Now the waist fit me just fine when I finished this blazer, but the sleeve was too tight and it was a little bit too short. Now I can do my own alterations the next time I make this blazer, but I'm just letting you guys know what happened and what I did. The fabric that I chose for this blazer was a crepe fabric that I purchased from Spoon Flower. I had it in my fabric stash, as well as the lining, which was a satin fabric that I chose for my lining. Now the crepe fabric, it is a lightweight fabric, and I did have to interface the front bodice and the back bodice of the blazer with a lightweight woven interfacing to give it some weight to the blazer. The next time I'm going to use a suiting fabric, because the suiting fabric has a better weight to it, I think. I'm still going to have to interface the suiting fabric just to get it a little bit of stiffness, but other than that, that's what I'm going to do next time. The satin fabric that I use for the lining, I won't use again because it frays a lot, and also when you pull the pieces apart, you'll see the stitching in the lining, and I don't like that either. So yeah, lesson learned on that end as well. Now it's your preference. You can use whatever fabric you're comfortable with. The instructions putting this pattern together, they weren't really clear to me. Also, looking at the pictures weren't that clear to me, but like, I'm not an experienced tailor. The lady that put this pattern together is an experienced tailor, and she just used her terminology and her knowledge to try to explain how to assemble this pattern. But I hope my illustration can help you out as well. Like I said, I love the pattern. I will make it again in a suiting fabric. I will choose a different lining to use, and I am going to go up a couple sizes. So let's get started putting it together. Hey guys, today's tutorial is on the Fernanda Blazer by Vicky Sews. I didn't make any modifications to this blazer at all. I just cut out my size, and I'm just going to put the pieces together because the measurements that I saw on the pattern instructions, they fit my waist, my bust, and my hip size. So that's why I selected a size 38. Now the pattern piece we're going to start off first with is the back piece. You would have to cut 2 pieces of fabric plus 2 pieces of interfacing. You're going to take your back pieces and apply the darts, your waist dart, your shoulder dart. So with right side spacing, you're going to take your dart and match the notches. You're going to pin, and you're also going to pin at that dot. You're going to pin in the center of your waist dart to match the other dot on the other side. And put pins at the beginning and the end of your dart so you know where to start and stop stitching. And you're going to do the same thing for the other piece. Now at your shoulder dart, you're going to start stitching from those notches on your shoulder, and you're going to stitch all the way down to that bottom dot. And just make sure this is attached real close together. Because you are going to sew both pieces on the side seam together, so I want everything to match up, including the markings for the welt pocket on both sides. You're going to do it for both sides, and you're going to stitch 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. You're going to stitch 3/8 of an inch on the side front seam. Back stitch. And at the very end, you're going to back stitch. And you're going to remove the tape. Okay, now that you have finished applying your front side piece, you're going to put some interfacing on the wrong side of your pocket opening, and that's what we're about to work on now. So with right sides facing, you should have made some markings of 2 dots, a top dot and a bottom dot for the opening of your welt pocket. You're going to take now the top pocket welt and the bottom pocket welt, and with the right sides facing, you should have made 2 notches. It should be 1/4 of an inch from the edge to match the dots on the top of your welt opening. That's where you're going to place your top pocket welt, and then you're going to place the bottom pocket welt right underneath with matching the dots. I put some marking dots on the welt on the wrong side of each welt piece. So I'm going to put a pin through and pin each piece to the front of your blazer. And you're going to stitch both of these pieces down by turning them over and stitching the lines that you should have transferred from your pattern pieces onto the back of the blazer. You're going to stitch the top line and the bottom line of your welt pocket opening. Now with wrong sides facing you, you're going to put the needle through the top dot and you're going to back stitch at that dot and go all the way across to the other dot. You're going to back stitch at that dot. Do the same thing for the bottom. Put your needle down, remove your pin so it won't get in the way. Back stitch. Back stitch at the bottom. Now to close in your pocket, you're going to start at the top edge and you're going to back stitch. You're going to stitch 3/8 of an inch seam allowance all the way around the pocket and also the top of the pocket. You're going to go right over the triangle where you closed in your welt for the front of the blazer. Now go really slow around the bottom corners of your pocket. Now, once you get finished sewing from side to side, from the side, the bottom, and the other side of the pocket, you're now going to stitch the pocket closed on the top. So lift up your pressure foot, pivot your fabric with the needle still through your fabric, and stitch right across the top, using still 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now, to secure your pocket down, you're going to flip your fabric to the right side and stitch in the ditch in the top seam of the pocket welt. Now let's attach the chest pocket welt. Now you're going to have to cut one piece of fabric and cut one piece of interfacing. I chose the left side to put my welt pocket on. So you're just going to fold it in half and pin each side, and then you're going to stitch 3/8 of an inch on both sides. Now for both sides of your pocket flap, you should back stitch on the top and the bottom on both sides, and you will trim 1/8 of an inch of fabric off the sides and turn it inside out and pushing your corners out with a corner pusher, and then pressing your pocket flap flat. Now when attaching your chest pocket welt on the right sides, make sure you made your markings on the wrong sides and the right side of your fabric so you know where to place your pocket flap. Matching the dots on both sides of your pocket flap to the bottom dots of your pocket welt opening, you're going to pin, and then you're going to stitch across 1/4 of an inch from side to side. Now you're going to stitch on the wrong sides of your fabric at the very bottom dots from one side to the other. Now before we turn the pocket on the inside of your blazer and make some cuts, you're going to press your chest pocket welt flat so you can get it out the way so you won't cut it. And now you're going to make some cuts across the opening line of your welt pocket on the sides of the triangles, to but not through to the stitching. Do not cut your stitching. And then we're going to push the pocket facing lining through the opening, and we're going to stitch the sides of the triangles down like we did the bottom welt pockets of your blazer. Stitch around from side to the bottom to the other side using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now you have the choice of slip stitching or top stitching the chest pocket flap down to your blazer. Now that you have slip stitched or top stitched your chest pocket flap down to the front of your blazer, now we're going to work on the front facing by attaching that to the front of your blazer. Now you should have cut out 2 pieces of fabric and interfaced both of those pieces. Now with right sides facing, you're going to lay the front facing on top of the blazer, and you're going to match the notches and pin, and then stitch 3/8 of an inch seam allowance from the top of the facing Now you're going to make a clip into the seam allowance at the lap break point. You're going to stopping 2 millimeters from the stitching line. So don't cut all the way through your stitching. Then you're going to press the seam allowance at the very bottom of that clip flat, and the seam allowance above the clip, you're going to press it towards the inside of your blazer. Now we're going to make a marking so you know where your lapel break will be. So stick a pin through that clip that you made in the seam allowance, and then get some tailor's chalk and make a line so you'll know where your lapel break will be. And then after that, you're going to understitch the seam allowance down on your front facing. Now after you have understitched the seam allowance at the lapel break down to the hem and also trimmed your seam allowance, you're now with right sides facing. You're going to take the front facing and pin at the very top of your lapel to the gorge line. And then from that pin to the lapel tip, you're going to stitch 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now you're going to turn the front facing right side out and push out the lapel corners with your corner pusher. Now you're going to place the front and the back right sides together, align all at the shoulder and the side edges, matching the notches, and pin, and you're going to stitch the shoulders and the side seams using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. We're now going to attach the back neck facing to the front facing. Now, to make you more, I guess, understanding of how we attach the facing, you should have cut one piece of fabric on the fold as well as one piece of interfacing on the fold. And as you see here, this is the facing, and these are the parts that we're going to attach the back facing to. So open your facing with the fabric facing you and lay it just like this, so it's more understanding to you, and then you're going to attach it here and pin. And the other side, I'm going to attach and pin. And you're going to stitch 3/8 of an inch on both sides across. And then afterwards, we're going to work on the collar. Now we're stitching the back neck facing to the front facing of the blazer using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Back stitch at the top and the bottom. Okay, now press your seams open. Now we're going to work by assembling the collar of the blazer. We're going to work with the upper collar, the under collar, and the collar stand. With the upper collar, you should have cut out one piece of fabric on the fold, also interfaced the piece using cutting out one interfacing fabric on the fold as well. With the under collar, you should have done the same thing by cutting one on the fold of fabric and cutting one on the fold of interfacing. And with the collar stand, you should have cut out two pieces of fabric and cut out two pieces of interfacing. All three of these pieces should be infused with interfacing. Now you're going to open up your under collar and your upper collar, and you're going to place the collar stand with the side that doesn't have the notches on it, right sides together, matching the center back, and you're going to pin. And once you fit the collar stand all the way to the sides of each, now remember to leave the side with the notches for applying them to the blazer. So when you apply or when you attach your collar stand to your collar, you're going to attach it with the side that doesn't have the notches on it. After you pin, we're going to stitch 3/8 of an inch from side to side. And we're going to do that for both collar pieces. Now for both pieces, like I said, we're going to stitch using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then we're going to press the seam, oh well, before we press the seams open, we're going to make notches to but not through the stitching. And then we're going to press the seam open. Now we're going to back stitch at the beginning and the end of attaching the collar stand to the upper and under collar. Back stitch. Okay, now that you have attached your collar stand to your upper collar piece and your under collar piece, now you're going to make notches, maybe an inch or inch and a half apart from each other, to but not through, to your stitching. And then we're going to press the seam allowance flat and stop your needle at that dot and back stitch. Just like that. We're going to attach the collar to, I know this looks kind of funny of how I have it laid out because of the colors, but this is the front and this is the back. Now, this is the back neckband facing that's attached to the front facing. Now, we're going to take the upper collar piece. Now, so it's not so difficult for you. You should always mark under collar or upper collar if you're, if you're not that comfortable knowing which pieces to work with. So I know I did the understitching to the under collar. So I know this back piece is my under collar. This front piece is my upper collar. So I'm going to take my upper collar piece with right sides facing and attach it to my back neckband. So with the notch of the notches that are on the collar stand, I'm going to attach that with right sides facing to the back neckband. And I made a notch for the center back of the neckband so I can match my notch that I made on my collar stand. I'm also going to the notches that are on my collar stand, attach them, pin them to the shoulder seams of the back and front facings. And with this pattern, with Vicky Sew's pattern, I made my own markings of where my seam allowance is going to stop with making dots at the corners of my collars, my collar points. So I took my measuring my measuring gauge that has the center, the seam allowance measurements on it, and the 3/8 seam allowance I took and I laid it at the corner and at an angle. So that's where I'm going to make my dot, and that's where my stitches are going to stop and pivot to the other dots that I've placed on my collar pieces. So I did on both sides, this side and also this side. And also I did it, I placed dots on my facings as well, so I'll know where to stop stitching, because I don't want to stitch in that slash that I made already. I'm going to stitch past that slash. So that's where I'm going to put a pin in my collar piece and a pin through the dot on the facing. So I'll know everything is even on both sides of where to stop my stitching. And I'm going to do the same thing for the other side. And now I'm going to place some pins through the openings of the collar stand. And I'm going to stitch using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance from one side to the other. From here, this dot to that dot. Okay, now make sure that your fabric is flat, no bulkiness or anything, and make sure your other piece of the collar is out of the way. At that dot that you made at the end of your collar, you're going to put your needle down between that dot, remove your pin, press your foot down. You're going to back stitch and stitch 3/8 of an inch seam allowance all the way across. Okay, so there you have it. It's attached. Now you're going to press that. Okay, now that you have attached your the top collar to the back facing, now you're going to, remember, this is your back piece and these are your front pieces. We're going to flip it again, making sure the right sides of your fabric are facing each other. So with the center back seam and the center back of the collar stand, you're going to match the seam and the notch. You're going to pin. You're going to match the shoulder seam and the other notch together. And the shoulder seam on this side and the notch. And the point on the other side of the facing, that's in the front here, if you can see this, this corner here, from the point of your flat collar here, this crease here, you're going to match this other part, the other end of your collar too. So put a pin through the dot and to the dot of the blazer, and make sure everything is even on both sides. And you're going to pin. And do the same thing for the other side. Make sure you match that dot with this dot at the other seam. And pin. And we're going to stitch from that dot all the way to the other dot. Let me make sure I put some more pins here so everything can be even and flat. You don't want any bulkiness in your collar. And sometimes you have to make sure everything, you know, go through to make sure everything lays properly, so you'll have a nice fitted collar. Okay, so come back, and then after stitching 3/8 inch all the way from one side to the other, we're going to attach the side of the collars to the facing and the front of the blazer. Now we're attaching the undercollar to the back of the blazer. So make sure you put the needle at the dot. Remove your pin, put your pressure foot down, and you're going to back stitch. And we're stitching using 3/8 inch seam allowance. Back stitch. Make sure everything is flat. Okay, now with the collar attached on the back of the blazer at the center back, now we're going to work with the sides of the collar. And now I've took out the points of the front facing of the front flap so I could attach the side of the collars. So with this opening here, you're going to attach the under collar and the upper collar to the front facing and the front of the blazer. So with this center seam here, you're going to match that with the seam here at the collar point. So with the right sides facing, you're going to match that seam there. And you can put a pin through that dot that you made earlier to find the dot of the flap. And you're going to stitch, after you pin it down, you're going to stitch from that dot at the end of the collar to the middle of the collar. And then after you stitch here and stop, back stitch on both points, you're going to do the same thing for the front of the collar. Stitching at that point. And stitching down at that dot. And take your time, you're not rushing, to make sure these pieces of the collar are attached. And you're going to do the same thing for the other side. And after you do that, you're going to flip it wrong sides together, and then you're going to press. Now where you made this slash onto the front facing, at that dot on the collar, you're going to place your needle through that dot. Remove your pin, you're going to back stitch. You're going to stitch 3/8 of an inch to the middle part of the open seam, the side seam of the collar. Back stitch at that dot. top here at that notch and back stitch. Okay, now we're going to work on the sleeve. For the top sleeve, you should have cut 2 pieces of fabric, and for the bottom sleeve, you should have cut 2 pieces of fabric. Now, both the top and the bottom, you have to put interfacing on the top and underneath the underarm on the bottom of the sleeve, and also on the wrists of all 4 pieces, like you see here. Now, with right sides together, you're going to match the top and the bottom sleeves together at the notches at the underarm seam, all the way down to the hem. You're going to find the notches, you're going to pin, and you're going to stitch 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now that you have attached your top and bottom sleeve pieces together using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and you pressed your seams open, now you're going to lay your lining pieces right sides facing, and you're going to stitch the very bottom of the sleeve using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now you're going to place the sleeve and the sleeve lining right sides together, align the elbow edges matching the notches, and you're going to pin, and then you're going to stitch 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, now that you have attached the sleeve at the elbow edge, now you're going to press your seams open on the fabric side of your sleeve and then press your seam allowance flat on the lining side. Now you're going to turn your sleeve inside out and press the hem of the sleeve. Now I skipped this method by using a hand basting technique to base stitch my lining to my fabric in the inside, but you can measure 2 centimeters, which is 3/4 inches from the hem up, to do a base stitch around your sleeve. Now with the top of the sleeve cap, you're going to stitch gathering stitches from notch to notch. Now, after applying the gathering stitches around the sleeve cap, you're now, with right sides facing, going to fit the sleeve in the armhole and match the notches with the underarm seam and the top of the shoulder seam. And then you're going to pull your gathering stitches around the sleeve cap to fit around the top of the armhole. Now you're going to stitch the bottom of the hem using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, now that you have attached your lining to the bottom hem of your blazer, there are some little vent openings on the side at the bottom of the blazer, near the bottom of the facing, that you're going to hand stitch closed. I mean, or you could just leave it open if you like, it's your preference, but you can hand stitch it by slip stitching it closed on both sides. Okay, now that you have attached your blazer lining to the hem of your blazer, now we're going to work on attaching the circumference of the lining around the armhole to the circumference of the lining of your blazer. So no matter what side you want to start off with, grab the opposite sleeve through the opposite opening of your lining, so we can attach the circumference of your lining around the circumference of the blazer lining for your sleeve. Now with right sides facing, make sure all your notches from your back, your front, your shoulder, and your underarm seam notches are applied to the sleeve lining and the blazer lining. So with right sides facing, like I said before, you're going to match your back notch of your sleeve to the back notch of your blazer lining. And then you're going to pin your back notch, your front notch, your shoulder seam notch, and your underarm seam notch. And then after pinning those, you're going to finish pinning around the circumference of your armhole and stitch 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, starting at the underarm seam. Now to close in the other arm hole of the sleeve, you're going to have to make a incision in one of the panel seam allowances so you can reach through and do the same thing like you did for the other sleeve. Hey guys, this concludes the tutorial on the Fernanda Blazer by Vicky Sews. I hope you enjoyed watching me put this blazer together, and please hit that notification bell for upcoming videos and tutorials, and make sure you subscribe. So take care guys, and thanks for watching.